Welcome to the first episode of the Crime Noir podcast. We will be talking about crimes and criminals that many people may have never heard of. The stories I hope to tell may involve crimes that had local interest, and some may have been national news at the time but have faded from memory. Some of the stories will be disturbing, some will be humorous, and a few may be hard to believe. But hopefully, all will be interesting. Now, I could follow the crowd and talk about the New York crime families or the famous serial killers and pick apart every nuance of every action they ever took, but I doubt I could shed any more light on them than has already been cast. Instead, I'm here to bring you unique and lesser-known crime stories because, frankly, how many more stories about Tommy DeSimone or Charles Manson do we really need? I plan to release about one of these each month. If you find what I'm talking about interesting, hit the like and subscribe buttons to be notified when I post a new video. If you know of some obscure crime that you think needs a closer look, mention it in the comments. So without further ado, let's get into it. What happened to the Eggman? This story begins on a chilly Kentucky morning in a small town named Persimmon Grove. Located just south of the Campbell County seat at Alexandria, there wasn't much in Persimmon Grove beyond a few farms, some houses, the Baptist church, and George Hawkins' grocery store. It was April 3rd, 1961, and a bit cool for April. The temperature had fallen below freezing overnight, and some of the shallow puddles were still frozen as George Hawkins got into his car, a year-old Plymouth station wagon. George had a busy day planned up in Newport. He found himself going to Newport much more often than he had before. There were so many things going on. Between his deliveries, an appointment with his lawyer, and a doctor's visit, he wouldn't get home in time for dinner tonight. George Hawkins was 47 years old and stood 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed a portly 190 pounds, and semi-rimmed glasses framed his somewhat nearsighted eyes. He bore the unmistakable look of a grocer, but that was misleading. He carried a .32 revolver holstered in his waistband and a sap in his back pocket. In addition to operating his grocery store, George had a second job as the Constable for the 7th Magisterial District located in southern Campbell County, Kentucky. Ordinarily, being a constable was a part-time community service job. It mostly involved serving court documents and working with the county police to keep law and order in the unincorporated communities that are still so common in Kentucky. But this was Campbell County in the early 1960s. Law and order were somewhat dubious matters, and George was right in the middle of it all. To explain it, I'm going to have to digress a few times, so please bear with me. First, a little background. Newport, Kentucky lies on the Ohio River directly across from Cincinnati. In 1803, Newport's founder, James Taylor, not that James Taylor, this guy. James Taylor engaged his cousin, future President James Madison, to convince the War Department to relocate the regional army post to Newport from what was then Fort Washington on the Ohio side of the river. Initially, the soldiers weren't very welcome in Newport. Army life was not the constant excitement that we see in movies and on TV today. Back then, it was drill, more drill, clean some things, drill some more, and a lot of downtime. Bored soldiers get into trouble, and soon after the Newport barracks opened, there were complaints of soldiers harassing the women of the town and shooting at the hogs that often wandered the streets. The Newport barracks typically held a company of about 100 soldiers and 5 to 10 officers. It was an important recruiting and supply depot for the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Civil War. As each conflict approached and played out, large numbers of troops assembled at the Newport barracks, and, as so often happens near military bases, the area immediately around the Newport barracks soon became populated with saloons, gambling houses, and brothels. In this case, they were all situated on Taylor Street, right outside the gates of the post. While the saloons were okay, gambling and prostitution were illegal, but local officials were willing to look the other way, provided they got a few dollars under the table and the owners kept things from getting out of hand. The officers at the barracks did not much care about what their men did with their off time so long as they didn't desert. and the townspeople were all right with it. At least the soldiers weren't shooting their hogs and accosting their daughters anymore. With the coming of the Civil War, large numbers of Union troops passed through the Newport barracks, and Taylor Street added more vice dens to support them. I couldn't find any pictures of Taylor Street. It wasn't the sort of thing a photographer would expend his efforts on. The war ended, but the diversions of Taylor Street stayed open and even grew as a torrent of workers came to the area thanks to a booming post-war economy. When the Central Bridge opened in 1890, workers from Cincinnati could avail themselves of the vice to be found on Taylor Street without using the ferry, and the vice dens flourished. The Newport barracks was closed in 1894 due to repeated floods, and the soldiers were relocated to the drier hills south of town. The new post was much larger, and an infantry regiment moved into the newly christened Fort Thomas. The people living in the new town did not permit the kind of vice that flourished in Newport, but Taylor Street stayed in business thanks to the electric railroad that made any diversion a soldier could want just a short ride down the hill. Taylor Street stayed within its confines, and otherwise Newport was an ordinary small town. Then came Prohibition. Prohibition had a profound effect on the entire country, and that effect was magnified in Newport. In the early Prohibition years, it was said that the west end of Newport reeked of mash because nearly every resident was either fermenting grain or distilling whiskey in their backyard. People took to burning tires to cover the smell. The bars stayed open as if nothing had changed, and even the Wiedemann Brewery continued to brew beer on the sly. Prohibition institutionalized graft. It turned bribery from something that was small-scale and tolerated with a wink and a nod into a way of life, as countless police officers, judges, and local politicians were being paid to look the other way and let the whiskey flow. In Newport, it created a culture of corruption that lingered long after Prohibition was gone. The people of Newport fell into three categories. There were those who participated in the graft or worked in the businesses that benefited from it, those who had nothing to do with gambling and other vice but rationalized that they brought money into the town, and the smallest group who objected to the corruption and lawlessness on general principle. This last group adopted a head-in-the-sand approach to corruption and vice. They simply pretended it didn't exist. Right across the river was Cincinnati, and it was no more than 8 hours by train from most of the major population centers east of the Mississippi. This drew gangsters from around the country to the area, including a man named George Remus, who relocated from Chicago to Cincinnati and built the largest illegal liquor operation in America. Remus was dubbed the King of the Bootleggers for the size and complexity of his organization and the conspicuous flaunting of his wealth. Remus employed hundreds of people to supply a sizable portion of the illegal alcohol that was consumed in the eastern half of the country. His brewing and distilling operations were so extensive that he was forced to buy a local yeast company to ensure he had a reliable supply. A number of locals who would go on to be major players in Newport's gaming industry were first employed by George Remus. Remus was wildly successful, but did not take federal law enforcement very seriously. He thought he would be safe as long as he had the local police on his payroll. But the size of his operation, its openness, and Remus's hubris made him a plum target for the new Prohibition Unit, which landed Remus in federal prison in 1926. In the power vacuum that followed, Mo Dalitz, a former member of Detroit's Purple Gang and now an associate of the Cleveland Syndicate, arrived in Newport to take over Remus's operations. He brought with him three individuals who were experts in the liquor business: Sam Tucker, Morris Kleinman, and Louis Rothkopf. These four men became collectively known as the Cleveland Four, and together they took over most of the bootlegging business centered in southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. Some of Remus's crew went to work for the Cleveland Four, but others struck out on their own, and soon nearly every street corner in the center of Newport boasted a saloon. In Kentucky, speakeasies were called tiger blinds, and in Newport, the tiger blinds often hosted brothels and backroom gambling, but it was relatively small scale. With the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, these crime interests found the flow of cash from illegal liquor ebbing away, so they needed to find other avenues to keep the money coming in. Cincinnati's central location and excellent rail service made it a convention hub from the 1930s through the 1960s, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Dalitz and his associates saw those convention goers and traveling businessmen as an opportunity, and Newport, where they already owned most of the clubs, was a 10-minute cab ride from about any hotel in downtown Cincinnati. Understanding that men who were away from their wives and families sometimes liked to let loose a little, there was a market that the gangsters could serve. Newport, with its pliable city government and cooperative police force, was the perfect place to serve that market. The organized syndicates kept their clubs and operated them much as they had before Prohibition was repealed, except the focus shifted away from simple bootlegging to gambling and prostitution. In many cases, the mob bought houses near the clubs so the girls could pick up a trick in the bar and close the deal off-site. Peter Schmidt was a former associate in the Remus organization. Schmidt started as a truck driver and rapidly rose to run Remus's transportation system. In the process, he amassed a good deal of money, which he frugally socked away for the future. While working for Remus, Schmidt ran a saloon at 928 Monmouth Street in Newport, and with the end of Prohibition, the future had arrived. He renovated the building from top to bottom, and he named it the Glen Hotel after his son. There was a bar-restaurant on the first floor, a casino on the second, and a sports book on the third. It was an upscale spot, but not quite where Pete wanted to go. In 1935, Schmidt bought a saloon called the Old Kaintuck Inn, located on 20 acres atop a hill in nearby Southgate, Kentucky. He completely remodeled the original building and expanded it to include a restaurant, a small lounge that featured entertainment, and a casino. Schmidt also ran a dairy farm and stabled horses on the property, mostly to cover for what was actually going on. He named it the Beverly Hills Club and had some success. Maybe a little too much success. Mo Dalitz happened to visit the club and thought perhaps Pete could use a partner. Pete didn't feel that way, but Dalitz was not a man who took no for an answer. Shortly, a program of harassment began. The club was robbed at gunpoint a few times, and the police were surprisingly slow to arrive on the scene. It got to the point that Schmidt stopped reporting the robberies. Customers were beaten up or robbed in the parking lot, and again, the police were slow to react. After being reminded that situations that endangered or even injured civilians were bad for everybody's business, the gangsters tried a new tactic. They decided to burn the place down. On the night of February 2nd, 1936, 3 men broke into the club carrying 10 gallons of gasoline. They spread the gas all around the first floor and left the now partially filled cans in the middle of the barroom. There were a couple of things they didn't count on, however. In the time it took to spread the gasoline around the building, the fumes had also spread. It was freezing out that night, and convection from the furnace spread the fumes throughout the building. When one of the arsonists struck a match to ignite the blaze, instead of a fire, they got an explosion that blew out the doors and windows. Then the place caught fire. One of their groups suffered severe burns to his legs, the other 2 had minor injuries, but another thing they did not count on was that people were sleeping in the building. Pete Schmidt had a caretaker to handle the farm chores and take care of any needed repairs to the bar complex. He lived in an apartment on the second floor with his wife, and on this night his 5-year-old niece was visiting. All 3 escaped by jumping from a second-story window, but the little girl's nightclothes had caught fire. They fled to a neighbor's home 200 yards away, and the neighbor went down the hill and flagged down a passerby who took the family to Spears Hospital in Dayton. Carl and Viola Philhart recovered from their injuries, but little Marion Reardon died 2 days later. Arrests were eventually made, and a man who was not present when the fire was set but had sheltered one of the injured arsonists took the rap for the whole thing with the promise that syndicate lawyers would help him get a light sentence over Marion Reardon's death. He was taken care of when he got out of prison. He got 5 years but only served 18 months, and upon his release he was given a job at one of the casinos in town and eventually moved to Las Vegas, where he worked in several mob-connected casinos. None of this deterred Pete Schmidt, however. He rebuilt, this time leveling the ruins and constructing a completely new complex that he said would be the showplace of the nation. His new resort included a much larger restaurant, a bar, and a huge showroom in which he would book nationally known performers. He located his new casino in a separate building behind the main facility. Pete Schmidt named his new place the Beverly Hills Country Club, and his grand reopening was attended by Governor A.B. Happy Chandler, U.S. Senator Marvel Logan, and most of the local government officials. In the end, though, thumbing his nose at the syndicate was not a smart move for Pete. Shortly after the opening, the harassment began again. There were no firebombings this time. Instead, they utilized the county police to conduct random raids on the casino. The building was frequently vandalized, and they developed one particularly sophomoric method of harassment. Randomly, 2 or more of the syndicate's men would walk into the club lobby and urinate on the carpet in front of the customers. I've been unable to trace how often this happened, but it happened enough that a name was coined for it: ding-donging. Things escalated to harassment of his other operations and threatening phone calls to his house, so that by 1940, Pete Schmidt had had enough. He surrendered the Beverly Hills Club to Mo Dalitz and the Cleveland Syndicate. When Pete Schmidt opened the new Beverly Hills Country Club in 1936, he had shown what could be done, and the other gangsters followed. Newport saw a remodeling boom as the syndicates and local operators emulated what Schmidt had built. A very short time later, the 633 Club, soon to be renamed the Flamingo, opened at 633 York Street. Initially opened by local operator Artie Dennard, Ed and Louis Levinson took it over on behalf of the Cleveland Syndicate. The Yorkshire was a block north at 518 York Street. The registered owners were Joe and Martin Berman, but their silent partner was Meyer Lansky on behalf of the Luciano crime family. The Primrose Country Club was at 15 Licking Pike, just outside of Newport. Originally built as a slaughterhouse, it was rebuilt in the 1890s as a saloon. Eugene Buck Brady bought the building in 1936 and renamed it the Primrose Country Club. When it began to pull business away from the Cleveland Syndicate's Beverly Hills Country Club, the syndicate forced Brady out and took the Primrose over. It was later renamed the Latin Quarter. The Stark Club was at 613 Monmouth Street. It was opened by Wilder Town Marshal Big Jim Harris. The club changed hands and names numerous times, from the Stark Club to the Stork Club, then the Silver Slipper, the Galaxy Club, and finally it became a strip joint, officially called the Brass Mule, but known to everyone as the Brass Ass. It remains in operation today as the last remnant of Newport's syndicate past. The Merchants Club was at 15 East 4th Street in Newport. While the Merchants Club was never considered a high-class casino, it served as the headquarters of Albert "Red" Masterson, an enforcer for the Cleveland Syndicate. It was Masterson who sent the arson team to the Beverly Hills Club. These were only some of the larger clubs. There were dozens of smaller places dotting most of the city center and West End. All of these clubs operated openly. There were no secret knocks or passwords to gain admittance. A person simply walked off the street into a casino. In addition to the casinos, at least 10 brothels were operating within a 5-block radius of the county courthouse. In the 1940s, it was said that any vice a man might desire could be had in Newport. That was not much of an exaggeration. So this brings us back to George. George Hawkins lived and worked in this environment, and on that chilly Monday morning, he was headed to Newport to make his usual rounds. It was common knowledge that most of the Newport Police Department were on the take from the gambling interests, as were members of the city council, the mayor, and the Campbell County Sheriff. There was tension in the town between the syndicate operators who ran the larger upscale clubs on Monmouth and York Streets and the local operators whose smaller, seedier establishments dotted the side streets. The allegiance of the city officials shifted between the two groups with the ebb and flow of city politics and who was paying the most money at any given time. George, however, was not part of or beholden to any faction and was in a unique position to benefit from either of them. In November of 1941, George Hawkins was elected constable for the 7th Magisterial District of Campbell County, Kentucky. The duties of a constable vary depending on their district. They are officers of the county courts, and some of them act as first responders and work with county or state police in dealing with crime. They may have deputy constables under themselves in some cases. However, they mostly do mundane administrative tasks such as serving warrants and subpoenas. But constables are sworn law enforcement officers with arrest powers. In the words of a recent expose on the constables, they are untrained and unaccountable. This is important to our story because of how jurisdiction was organized in Kentucky during this period. Each city in Kentucky was classified based on its population, and there were 6 classes. In 1961, the Kentucky State Police had jurisdiction throughout the state, but they could not enter a city of the 2nd or 1st class to enforce the law unless the governor declared a state of emergency or the local officials requested their assistance. Every county had an elected sheriff, but their duties varied from county to county. In Campbell County, the sheriff was technically a law enforcement officer, but he had no investigators. The primary job of the Campbell County Sheriff was enforcing business licensing ordinances, providing bailiffs for the county courts, and collecting taxes. County law enforcement was vested in the county police led by the county judge executive, an elected office. Like the state police, the county was also barred from enforcing the law in a city of the 2nd class. Newport, with a population of nearly 30,000, just happened to be a city of the 2nd class. Then there were the municipal police departments. In Campbell County, there are 3 towns on the south bank of the Ohio River: Newport, Bellevue, and Dayton. Each had a police department, and with about 40 officers, Newport's was the largest. The Dayton and Bellevue police each had 8 to 10 officers. In this hierarchy, even though the constables were effectively part-time policemen and had no resources to speak of, they technically had more law enforcement power than any of the other agencies because their jurisdiction extended across an entire county. You see, as a constable with arrest powers throughout the county, George could conduct a one-man raid on any casino he wanted and shut it down. George took this to heart, and soon after he was sworn in, he conducted a raid by himself on the Yorkshire Club. That was a ballsy move for a constable. Right out of the box, he hits a place owned by Meyer Lansky. He made 2 arrests and confiscated 3 dice from one of the tables as evidence. The case went to the grand jury and was subsequently rejected, but the newspapers reported that certain rural law enforcement officers were attempting to extort protection money from gaming interests. Things seemed to quiet down for a couple of years, but then, in March of 1944, George pulled over a car driven by Mrs. Ruth Schmidt. She was the wife of Albert Schmidt, no relation to Pete Schmidt. Albert Schmidt was then known to be the head of a major Cincinnati numbers racket. Before we move on, a quick explanation of what the numbers racket is. You hear about it in just about every gangster movie, but I don't think most people know what it is or how it works. Numbers, sometimes called policy, is similar to the Pick 3 games that most state lotteries run today. On its face, it's a pretty straightforward game. The player picks a 3-digit number and places a bet on it. If the number comes up, the player wins a payout. The more the player bets, the higher the payout. The main difference between the two is how the number is chosen. In the modern game, numbered ping pong balls are blown into a chute on a machine to make the determination, and the drawings are televised. That wouldn't work for illegal gamblers, so they base the number on the results of a selected race at a local track. A bettor at a racetrack can place a bet on a horse to win a race, to come in second or third. The 3 places are called win, place, and show, respectively. All of the money bet on the race is placed in a common pool called the parimutuel pool. When the race is finished, those who bet the winning horse to win get the highest payout. Those who bet the winning horse to place or to show receive smaller payouts. The amounts of the payouts are the parimutuel numbers. All of this is based on the odds and the amount of money bet on the horse. The track handicapper sets the initial odds based on the horse's lineage and racing history, but they will vary depending on the amount of money bet on the horse. As more money is bet on the horse, the odds will actually go lower, and each time the odds change and the parimutuel pool grows, the parimutuel numbers change. Numbers racketeers use the parimutuel numbers to set their winning number for the day by taking the last whole dollar digit from each payout. For example, if the numbers were $119.20 to win, $32.21 to place, and $9.80 to show, then the daily number would be 929. This was deemed a fair way to determine the number because the mutual numbers would be published in the newspapers and racing sheets, and the seemingly random results of a horse race would determine the number. That wasn't really true. Even a fairly run numbers game is a poor bet with odds in the neighborhood of 600 to 1, but criminal gangs always found ways to worsen the odds and improve their take on the racket. They would simply find ways to manipulate the number. If not directly owned by criminal elements, many racetracks were at least infiltrated by them. Numbers racketeers could place an associate at the track to monitor what was being bet and calculate what the number would be in different scenarios. If the number was trending toward a number that too many people were betting, the associate could place their own bets at amounts large enough to change the odds and skew the number. They could also place past-post bets to make the number whatever they wanted it to be. Dutch Schultz used this method to take over the New York numbers rackets, and he purchased the Coney Island racetrack in Cincinnati to support his operations there. As the track's owners, Schultz's operatives had no problem manipulating the number. So let's get back to George and Mrs. Schmidt. George claimed that Ruth had sideswiped him on Saratoga Street in Newport and did not stop, so he chased her down. When he approached the car, he noticed a box sitting on the back seat and a bag that appeared to contain slips of paper. Knowing that he could not search the car without a warrant, he took Mrs. Schmidt to the courthouse and sought one. Or alternately, he took Mrs. Schmidt to the courthouse to get her away from the car. He claimed that by the time he got back to the car, the box and the bag were gone, along with a black address book that was also in the car. Later investigation revealed that Ruth had not sideswiped Hawkins' car, and Hawkins had in fact searched the car without a warrant and confiscated the items. The box contained over $3,700 in cash, and the bag was full of play slips. The address book was also taken. It may be that George decided to keep the money and address book for himself. The case was thrown out, and Hawkins was ordered to return all confiscated property to Mrs. Schmidt. The money and the play slips were returned, but the whereabouts of the address book remained a mystery for a short time before Hawkins found it and gave it back. The book was reported to have contained the names and phone numbers of most of the people involved in Schmidt's numbers racket, including local police and other officials on Schmidt's payroll. When the address book was finally returned, several pages were torn out of it. Over the next year, George focused on disrupting the numbers rackets. He made several arrests, mainly of black store owners and barkeepers, but all of the cases were thrown out because George never got warrants before entering their establishments. That makes me believe that he was shaking them down. What these actions did was put George on the radar of Frank "Screw" Andrews, known to be a significant player in the numbers racket and also a violent man. On the night of May 19, 1946, two men shot out the windows of George's grocery store and sped away. In addition to his harassment of the numbers racket, George had also taken to confiscating slot machines, which could be found in many bars and small shops throughout Newport. George played the shooting off as the act of some drunken small-time slot operators, but it could also have been a warning from Screw Andrews. In the first 7 years of his tenure as a constable, George was very active in raiding various gambling activities, whether it was raiding casinos, arresting numbers runners, or confiscating slot machines. He was in the paper on a regular basis. Then, in early 1949, it stopped almost completely. The next arrest that George made on a vice charge was in September of 1954 when he arrested two women for solicitation. A year later, he swore out a warrant that led to a gambling raid on the Spotted Calf located at 5th and York Streets. On January 10, 1957, George appeared at a hearing in Campbell County Circuit Court regarding a charge of selling alcohol on Sunday, which he had brought against a Newport liquor dealer. Although selling liquor on Sunday was illegal in Campbell County at the time, the ban was widely ignored. George Hawkins had set up the buy using a friend of his to make the purchase. At the hearing, the defendant testified that he had met with George a few days before his arrest, and George solicited a bribe, which the defendant refused to pay. Hawkins admitted to being in the store that day, but said he was not asking for a bribe, but trying to get a reduced price on a bottle of whiskey he wanted to buy for a friend. The case was thrown out because, once again, George did not have a warrant to conduct his sting operation. After that, George seems to have stopped taking any anti-vice actions at all. This was possibly when the egg-selling scheme began. Louisville Courier-Journal reporter Hank Messick was the first to mention the egg story in a column published about 4 weeks after Hawkins disappeared. Messick was a longtime reporter for the Courier-Journal who focused on investigating organized crime, primarily the activities in Newport. He had a number of sources within the gambling organizations, and his reports were generally reliable. So this brings us back to that chilly April morning in 1961. George left his store a little after 8 a.m. He carefully eased his car out onto Persimmon Grove Pike. He was carrying several cartons of eggs in the back seat and didn't want to take a chance of cracking any of them. He would follow Persimmon Grove Pike to Alexandria, then take Alexandria Pike all the way to Newport, which worked out very well for him. Alexandria Pike ran right into Mama Street, where most of his deliveries were. He hadn't needed to raid a casino in quite a while. The people running them had decided it was easier to just pay him and send him on his way. In a technical sense, he wasn't accepting bribes to turn a blind eye. He was selling eggs. The eggs originally cost $100 each, but George raised the price, and some have said they were as high as $500 each. George spent the morning making his deliveries, which he completed in time for lunch. He then had an appointment with his lawyer, Charles Lester. Charles Lester was one of a large cast of characters who populated Newport in the 1940s and 50s. He was a lawyer who started his practice with high ideals as a crusader against gambling interests, but eventually fell for the money he could make working with the gamblers rather than against them. He was a Machiavellian character who changed sides with every shift of the wind. George needed to speak to him about an upcoming IRS audit. After his meeting with Lester, George called his wife to tell her he would be on his way home shortly, and that was the last his family ever heard from George Hawkins. Mrs. James Grimes lived at 2nd and Vine Streets in Dayton. The day after George failed to make it home, she came out of her house and noticed a car parked at the end of the street, almost on the riverbank. She didn't think much of it at first. Possibly a neighbor had gotten a new car. This was a nice one, a tan and white Plymouth Suburban station wagon. She remembered hearing a car door slam at about midnight on Monday night and surmised that that was when the car was left. After George Hawkins was reported missing on Tuesday morning, the police were alerted to be on the lookout for his car, and Dayton Police Chief John Moran came across the car Thursday afternoon. With help from the county police, Moran searched the car for clues as to where George might be. The key was still in the ignition, and the car had half a tank of gas. But they found the vehicle had been picked completely clean. There was no paper in the car. No registration, no insurance card, no receipts, nothing. Not even a gum wrapper. The carpets and seats were soaked. They had been washed with what appeared to be muddy river water. A canvass of the neighborhood found a witness who saw a tall man wearing a gray trench coat drop the car off on Tuesday morning. The lead was never followed up because the man did not match George Hawkins' description, and Chief Moran felt it was irrelevant. The car was released to the Hawkins family, and no further forensic investigation was performed. The Dayton Fire Department was called out. They dragged the river and a small creek nearby, but found no trace of George Hawkins. The investigation did find that Hawkins had visited a drugstore and grocery in Newport and was last seen on Mama Street between 6th and 7th Streets at about 2:15 on Monday. That was the last time he was seen by anyone. In a 2004 interview with James Reese of the Kentucky Post, longtime Newport politician and former mayor Johnny Peluso shared some information about the case. A week before George Hawkins disappeared, Peluso was working his regular job as a television repairman and was servicing the set at the Merchants Club, where mob enforcer Red Masterson had his headquarters. While working on the TV, Peluso overheard Masterson talking to someone on the phone saying, "The Eggman has to go." One thing that struck me when I read the piece was that Johnny, who was a candidate for county sheriff at the time, claimed to have heard this and did not feel the need to report what he overheard to the police. I understand that the gamblers infiltrated the Newport and Campbell County police, but once the state police took over the investigation, he could have safely gone to them. As far as is known, he never said a thing to anyone for over 40 years. Several years after George disappeared, his deputy, Edward Robinson, returned the Masonic ring and watch George was wearing that day to his wife, Mary. When asked where he got them, he said he had gotten them from Charles Lester. The disappearance of George Hawkins should have dominated the news and by itself started the downfall of illegal vice in Newport, but it was overshadowed by another event that occurred a short time later and made national headlines. Multiple congressional investigations have been conducted over the years, with Estes Kefauver's committee holding hearings in Cincinnati that focused on corruption in Newport in the early 1950s, but not much came of them. In 1960, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy came to the Cincinnati area for a campaign stop, and while there he visited Mrs. Ethel Steele, a Gold Star mother who lived at 11th and Park Avenue in Newport. Afterward, as JFK's motorcade passed down Monmouth Street toward Cincinnati, both he and his brother, future Attorney General Robert Kennedy, saw the casinos and strip clubs operating openly. It is said that Bobby made a mental note for future reference. With John F. Kennedy's election in 1960, the federal government took an interest in the goings-on in Newport. The Justice Department and the FBI began snooping around. It wasn't too hard for them to figure out who was operating the casinos in Campbell County. Most of them had bought federal gaming tax stamps. There had been reform movements in Newport over the years, but the syndicates had always been able to defuse them. Now things were changing. More pressure was being applied on the federal and state levels. The mob saw the writing on the wall and was now focusing on their casinos in Las Vegas where gambling was legal, so day-to-day operations in Newport were left to second-tier associates. With the federal government getting more involved and the state police becoming more active, a new reform group had come together and they decided to run a candidate for Campbell County Sheriff. That candidate was George Ratterman, former Notre Dame and Cleveland Browns quarterback, who had become an attorney after an injury ended his playing days. The story of how Ratterman found himself drugged and put in bed with a stripper named April Flowers made national headlines, and his trial in Newport Police Court on a charge of fornication marked the beginning of the end for open gambling in Newport, Kentucky. But that is a story for another day. Over the years, the story of George Hawkins faded away. I'd never heard of it myself until I stumbled across it while researching local history. I went to high school in Newport, and we discussed the gambling era, but Hawkins' disappearance was never mentioned. The focus was always on the Ratterman story and how George Ratterman cleaned up Newport. Hawkins' family claimed that he was honest, never took bribes from anyone, and they struggled financially after he disappeared. George Hawkins' grocery store, which was also the family home, was foreclosed 3 years later. George's wife had him declared dead in 1968 and remarried. In 1980, a skull was found on the Ohio riverbank in Carrollton, Kentucky, about 60 miles downstream from Newport. It was the skull of a middle-aged man, and the wear on it indicated that the person had died between 15 and 30 years prior to its discovery. The skull had a long, deep gash in the back, possibly caused by a hatchet or perhaps a tire iron or pipe. A forensic reconstruction was done, and the result bore a resemblance to that of George Hawkins, but it was not definitive. In 2017, George Hawkins' mother was exhumed to gather DNA for comparison to DNA recovered from the skull. The family had high hopes that the mystery of whether George had been murdered or simply run off to start a new life somewhere else would be solved, but those hopes were dashed. The DNA was not a match. In the end, George Hawkins' disappearance, along with the botched attempted frame-up of George Ratterman, started the decline of organized crime influence in Newport. The myth that the gangsters only attacked each other and left the townspeople alone was shattered, and public sentiment shifted to the side of the reformers. The decline was quick, and by early 1963, most of the casinos were closed down. There was still illegal vice in Newport, but it was driven underground and was on a much smaller scale than it had been. With the mob off to Las Vegas, most of the posh gambling dens soon became dingy strip clubs, and the loss of revenue drove the city into a rapid decline. It would take another 3 decades for Newport to break free of its Sin City moniker, and today it is a city of elegant Victorian homes restored to their former glory in its East End, a bustling entertainment district on its riverfront, and new million-dollar mansions sprouting on its hills to the south. It's a different town now. It's cleaner and more gentrified, and the kids don't have to walk past a strip club on their way to school. The old-timers have passed from the scene and been replaced with a younger, more energetic, and hopefully more honest generation. The city has reinvented itself, and while it is still an entertainment destination, it's the kind of entertainment you can take your family to see. So here ends the story of the disappearance of George Hawkins, and we are left with more questions than answers. Was George murdered, or did he take his graft money and start a new life under a new identity? Was he an honest crusader against illegal vice who became too much of a problem for the mob, or was he another public official on the take who just got to be too expensive? If he was making $500 for every egg he sold, what happened to the money? His family claims to have seen none of it. What are your thoughts? Share them in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. And join us next time as we head out to Hollywood. Next episode, The Mysterious Murder of William Desmond Taylor.